So join me on our journey into the third dimension. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. In the last video, we came up with a pretty good two-dimensional design for our coin grabber, and I'd really like to fine-tune that in 3 dimensions in this video. The problem with that is I think it's really going to test the limits of my 3D printer and also my brain. But before we begin, let's just review what we did in the last video. And this is what I ended up with. I ended up printing everything in a single color again, just because that makes it easier and the print resolution seems to work out a little bit better if the print nozzle stays warm the entire time. It's not switching between colors for each layer. But this is what I ended up with. I think there's some tweaks that I can still do here, but it seems to work pretty well. This lever is much thicker now, and it rotates in and out of position so that we can actually grab onto the coin. The size of that pivot is a little bit larger now, and that worked out very nicely. It printed pretty well, and the pieces interlock together very well now too. And we're getting a good action for capturing and releasing the penny, so I'm pretty happy with that. This rocks back and forth like that, and that almost closes. So in the next iteration, I'll have to close up that gap a little bit, make that gap a little tighter, but we're getting closer. I'm pretty happy with the way this works. So you can see that when there's a follower that comes along this path here, it will push down on this and release the coin. And I can kind of show you that in action too. If we're pushing down on this side of the bar, and that'll be controlled by a rubber band that spans this gap here. When we use that follower along the outside edge here, that'll push down on that and release the penny. So that actually works very well. Hey everyone, it's Future Me. I just wanted to take a moment to say that I've been doing some work on our website at thecoinbot.com. There you can find coin-related merch and get early access to my YouTube videos. I hope you'll get a chance to check it out and let me know what you think down in the comments. The problem with this design is that there's nothing holding this vertically in the coin slider, and this part can actually fall out. So I think we need to be thinking about this piece also in 3 dimensions. To this point, we've been thinking about this only in 2 dimensions. We draw a 2-dimensional version of this and then we extrude it into the 3D space. But this still has some thickness to it. We can prevent that from moving in this direction if we were to use half of the layers to control that direction, and then the other half to control the grabbing mechanism that we were talking about before. And if we could figure out a way on top of that to use a rubber band or some other mechanism to actually pull this into position, we'll be in much better shape because we'll have a positive stop and a positive control of the penny as it's being rotated over the coin studio. In our next iteration, I want to use some of the thickness of this to control the Z-axis here, because we can see that these pieces will actually snap apart if we're not careful when they're actually in the machine. So I want to make sure that that doesn't happen. We can use about half the thickness of this to control that movement. And there's a couple of other things. Like I said, I want to tighten up this gap a little bit. It doesn't need to be quite so wide. It doesn't have to move quite that much in order to capture the penny. And let's see, I also want to create an area that the rubber band can attach to. I think I'm going to do that underneath, and I'm going to try to do that with just half the thickness of the part, but we'll see how that goes. I'm going to play around in FreeCAD a little bit, but so far I'm pretty happy with the 2-dimensional aspects of this. We're going to take this and use half the thickness to control that sway here though. Now, since this part was so thin and there were so many little details that I had to think about, I found it really difficult to do all of that in my head. So what I found was that it was really helpful to actually draw on some of my prior 3D printed versions with a Sharpie marker so that I could kind of indicate to myself which pieces needed to come out of the Z-axis and which could stay on the same plane. It also helped to sketch this out on paper so that I could see at a glance which pieces needed to be on which layers as this thing printed out. So that was very helpful. Well, once I was done with that, we could start the actual 3D design work in FreeCAD, and we could see how all the pieces fit together. So moving between 2D and 3D for me is usually pretty easy. I can normally wrap my head around things like this pretty easily. I have a good mind for that. But I don't know if it's because this part is so thin and because there are so many little details that I need to add in order to get this all to work together, that I was really having a hard time wrapping my head around the three-dimensional aspects of this particular piece. And in FreeCAD, I was really having a hard time because I would have to keep switching between shaded and wireframe versions of the part. So that made it really difficult to maintain my perspective, both literally and figuratively. Now, designing with the full coin slider in mind meant that I could bring that entire part over to the bamboo slicer, and from there I could also cut out pieces of it so that I could reduce the amount of filament that I was wasting on each of these iterations. But of course, breaking that part up in the slicer itself meant that I had a slight learning curve again, and I had to learn how to do that in this new software package. So that took a little bit of a learning curve, but I eventually got that figured out. And in this time lapse, you can see that I actually ended up printing way too far from the camera. And I will try to remember to make sure that my prints are closer to the camera from now on so that you can actually see what's going on. Sorry about that. Oops. I consider this really a good first draft. There's still some issues. I need to widen this area a little bit more. The pivot seems to work okay. The handle is fine. I need to shorten this length. I had to actually physically cut that so that it worked a little bit better. And I need to figure out some other way to handle this rubber band issue. I think I might just cut through holes there, but we're on the right track. So I feel pretty good about this. We did solve the problem of the vertical alignment here. So I think with these, and this is a little bit stiffer now with this support material in here, so that's good. I'm gonna maybe do one more version of this during this video, and I know that there's gotta be an easier way to build this or to design it in the software, so I might start over from scratch there. The other thing that I noticed is that because I was only working with a little partial circle, the part ended up being flipped over, and I'll need to deal with that in the finished product. I need to figure out how to make this still printable when I'm all done. So a few challenges to figure out, but I'm actually pretty happy with the way everything lines up. As I talked about really briefly in the last little segment too, because I had been working on only just a little half moon shaped portion of the coin slider, I actually got that mixed up when I moved into the 3D world. I realized that I had actually created the holes on the wrong side of the coin slider, and it was no longer printable the way I had done it. So you actually have to think about the orientation of the finished part because you need to be able to print it on the 3D printer, and that requires you to be able to lay things down in layers. And the way that I had done it, there would have been extremely wide overhangs, which are not 3D printable. I kind of like this time lapse because of the camera angle. You can see the 3 dimensions that I'm trying to work with here, and how thin the parts are, so you can see how difficult this was for me to kind of wrap my head around. But overall, I think it's really starting to look pretty cool. I think I'm pretty close with this version, but there's still some tweaks I need to make. When I finish this design, you can see that the bar here still bends too easily, and I think I can fix that if I actually had that bar wrap around the pivot completely. And the other thing I'd like to improve is that I think there needs to be a little bit more room here for this swing mechanism to happen. So I want to make sure that there's enough room on both sides for this bar to swing widely on both sides so that we can be sure that we are either grabbing onto the coin and holding it firmly or releasing the coin. We want to make sure that those two actions are binary. It's either on or off. I don't want it to be stuck in some sort of weird limbo. But I think that's enough for today. In the next video, I'm going to try to fine-tune the design and add those couple of changes that we were just talking about. But for now, that's my 2 cents. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay tuned and stay awesome.